On a crisp autumn evening in Chicago, where the wind coming off Lake Michigan carried the scent of approaching winter, five men entered the founder's table with the quiet purpose of dismantling an empire. Their quarry was Arthur Sterling, a titan of American industry, a man whose engineering patents were the steel skeleton upon which much of the country's modern infrastructure was built. The men were ghosts, their faces forgettable, their movements economical, their intentions absolute. They had planned for reinforced vehicles, armed security, and silent alarms. The one variable their exhaustive risk assessment had failed to compute was the 22-year-old waitress with tired eyes and an almost supernatural stillness. The one refilling water glasses in the corner. Her name was Maya Jenkins. They saw a nobody. They were about to learn that in the high-stakes game they were playing, she was the one holding all the cards. This is not a story about a corporate takeover. It is the story of how a young woman's buried past, a legacy of smoke-filled rooms and calculated risks, erupted in a blaze of controlled chaos, and in the span of 17 minutes, fundamentally altered the course of a silent war being waged in the heart of the city. The founder's table was not a restaurant, it was an institution. Tucked away on a cobblestone street in the Gold Coast, it was a bastion of old Chicago, a place of dark wood, worn leather, and whispered deals. Its patrons were the architects of the city, their names carved into the foundations of banks and universities, their fortunes built on industry, not algorithms. New money was tolerated here, but it was expected to behave, to learn the quiet cadence of real power. On this particular Thursday, the dying autumn light cast long shadows through the restaurant's tall mullioned windows. The air was thick with the rich aromas of dry-aged steak, expensive bourbon, and the faint, sweet scent of cigar smoke from a bygone era. And moving through this carefully constructed world of masculine tranquility was Maya, a silent cog in a flawless machine. To the untrained eye, Maya was the epitome of unremarkable. That was her armor. She had honed the art of being overlooked into a shield. Her slender frame seemed to fold in on itself. Her movements were fluid and silent, her expression a placid mask of professional courtesy. She anticipated the need for a fresh napkin before a thought could form in a diner's mind. She cleared a finished plate with the stealth of a cat, and her presence was so unobtrusive that she often seemed to materialize from the shadows and then vanish back into them. She was, by all accounts, the perfect waitress. But beneath that calm facade, Maya was a vault of information, a human database of tells. She didn't just serve her customers, she read them. Mr. Henderson in booth 3, the real estate mogul, always tapped his pinky finger on his water glass twice before making an offer he knew was insultingly low. The Caldwells by the fireplace, celebrating their 40th anniversary, were a portrait of marital bliss. But she saw the way Mrs. Caldwell's smile never quite reached her eyes when her husband spoke of their future. Maya noticed the subtle shift of weight, the tightening of a jawline, the almost imperceptible flare of a nostril. It was a language she understood better than any other, a skill she had learned not in a classroom, but at her grandfather's knee in the smoky, high-stakes, and frequently dangerous underground poker rooms of Las Vegas. Tucked into the small pocket of her apron, her fingers often found their way to a single, smooth, clay poker chip. It was worn and faded, a cheap red chip from a long-closed casino, but it was the only tangible piece of her old life she allowed herself. It was her anchor, her reminder. At precisely 7:30 p.m., the heavy oak door swung open and Arthur Sterling stepped inside. The room did not fall silent, but the ambient hum of conversation shifted, dropping a few decibels, as if acknowledging the arrival of a true heavyweight. Sterling was not just rich, he was foundational. As the founder and CEO of Sterling Standard Engineering, he was a man who built things that lasted: bridges, turbines, engines. He was in his late 60s, with a mane of silver hair and a face that looked like it had been carved from granite. His suit was expensive but practical, and in his piercing gray eyes, there was a profound weariness that no amount of success could erase. He was alone, as he always was on the first Thursday of the month. He didn't have a security detail, a fact that seemed impossibly reckless for a man of his stature. He didn't come for the food, though it was the best in the city. He came for the quiet. "Your usual table, Mr. Sterling," the maitre d', a stately man named George, said with a nod of deep respect. Maya watched as Sterling was led to his preferred table in a secluded alcove. It offered a commanding view of the entire room while remaining partially obscured in shadow. It was a tactician's seat. Maya knew his order by heart, but protocol was protocol. She approached, her notepad a useless prop in her hand. "Good evening, Mr. Sterling. May I get you something to start?" He was studying the wine list, though she knew he would order the same 18-year-old single malt scotch he always did. "The Glenlivet. Neat," he said, his voice a low rumble, the sound of gears turning in a massive machine. "Of course," Maya replied, her voice a practiced gentle murmur. As she turned away, he spoke again, his tone slightly different, less automatic. "Miss Jenkins." Maya froze, turning back. He rarely used her name. He finally looked up from the menu, and his eyes, sharp and analytical, met hers. For a moment, she felt like a schematic he was deconstructing. "The prime rib. Is Chef Antonin in a good mood tonight?" It was a simple question, but it was more. It was his way of gauging the state of his world. Was the quality consistent? Were the standards holding? Was this one small bastion of order still reliable in a world that was increasingly not? It was a test of her observation. "His sous chef burned the béarnaise sauce earlier," Maya replied calmly, a flicker of a secret shared. "So he's been in a foul temper for the past hour, which means he'll be triple-checking every cut of meat to prove a point. I expect your prime rib will be the best you've had all year, sir." A ghost of a smile touched Sterling's stern lips before vanishing. "Very well." As Maya retreated to the bar, a strange tension coiled in her gut. Something was off. It wasn't Sterling, he was the constant. It was something else, a subtle dissonance in the restaurant's rhythm, a feeling she hadn't had since a high roller in Vegas tried to pass a marked deck at her grandfather's table. She wrote it off as paranoia, the ghost of an old life whispering warnings she no longer needed. She was wrong. At the service bar, waiting for the bartender to pour the scotch, she saw her own reflection in the mirrored wall behind the rows of glittering bottles. The face staring back was a carefully constructed fiction, plain, quiet, harmless. No one would guess that her small hands knew how to break a wrist with a single, sharp twist. No one could see the memories behind her placid brown eyes, the memory of her grandfather teaching her to spot a bluff in a man's pulse, and the memory of his old friend, a former pit boss named Frank, teaching her how to disarm a man twice her size who didn't take kindly to being caught. The smooth poker chip in her pocket felt suddenly cool against her fingertips. It was a reminder of the promise she'd made at her grandfather's funeral, a vow whispered over cheap whiskey and regrets. She would never be the one caught by surprise. She would always be the one who saw the cards before they were played. But even she couldn't have predicted the hand that was about to be dealt. At 8:12 p.m., the chime of the front bell sounded wrong. It wasn't the gentle announcement of a new arrival, but a sharp, abrupt clang, as if the door had been opened with force rather than courtesy. 5 men entered. They didn't come as a group, but in a staggered, unnervingly coordinated sequence that spoke of meticulous planning. The first 2 were dressed in dark suits that were just a little too plain, a little too functional for the founder's table. They moved past the maitre d's station without acknowledging him. One took up a position near the entrance, his back to the wall, his eyes doing a slow, methodical scan of the room. The other moved with liquid efficiency toward the rear hallway that led to the kitchens and restrooms. George, the maitre d', took a step forward, his mouth open to protest this flagrant breach of etiquette. But the first man turned his head slightly and gave a small, almost imperceptible shake. It was not a suggestion, it was a command. George froze, his years of experience telling him that this was a situation far outside the realm of an overbooked reservation. The next 2 men were bigger, built like the foundations of the bridges Arthur Sterling designed. Their jackets were cut to conceal, but Maya could see the rigid lines of body armor beneath the wool and the subtle, telltale bulge of a weapon holstered under the left arm. They moved with a predatory confidence, the walk of men who understood violence as a profession. One positioned himself near the bar, his gaze sweeping the room in a cold, systematic pattern. The other stood near the kitchen's swinging doors, effectively sealing off the staff's main escape route. The atmosphere in the restaurant underwent a chemical change. The warm, convivial buzz evaporated, replaced by a cold, prickling silence. Conversations died in mid-sentence. Forks hovered over plates. The air grew thick with a palpable, unspoken dread. Maya was standing by a service station, folding a napkin. Her hands didn't stop. The small, repetitive motion was an anchor in the sudden storm. But her mind was a whirlwind of calculations, processing the scene with the cold, detached clarity of a MasterCard player assessing a table. This wasn't a robbery. Robbers were loud, messy, and their objective was the cash register. These men were silent, disciplined, and their focus was singular. Her eyes flicked from one man to the next, cataloging their positions, their posture, their subtle hand signals. They were constructing a cage, and at the center of that cage was Arthur Sterling. The fifth man entered. He was the point of the spear. He was tall and thin, with pale skin and hair so black it seemed to drink the light. He wore a perfectly tailored Italian suit that cost more than Maya's car, and he moved with a chilling, reptilian grace. His eyes, the color of ice, found Arthur Sterling's table and locked onto it. A thin, cruel smile played on his lips. This was Silas. In the circles where such men were known, he was called the Auditor, a specialist in hostile acquisitions of the most physical kind. Maya's blood ran cold. She recognized the strategy. It was a classic four corners containment designed to isolate a target and eliminate any possibility of escape or interference. She'd seen diagrams of it in one of Frank's old security manuals, a relic from his days as a casino enforcer. Her fingers tightened around the poker chip in her pocket. Silas glided toward Sterling's table, his handmade leather shoes silent on the thick Persian rug. The two larger men began to move in concert, forming a flanking V formation behind him. Arthur Sterling had been watching the entire scene unfold in the reflection of his Scotch glass. When Silas arrived, Sterling didn't look afraid, merely weary, as if an unwelcome but not entirely unexpected business rival had crashed his dinner. He took a slow, deliberate sip of his Scotch before finally lifting his gaze. "Silas," Sterling's voice was a low growl of contempt. Thorne didn't have the courage to come himself, so he sent his bookkeeper. Silas's smile widened. "Mr. Sterling, always a pleasure. Mr. Thorne feels your last negotiation was incomplete. He's asked me to retrieve an asset you mistakenly took with you. He also asked me to express how very important it is that you cooperate, for the sake of everyone here." At his subtle gesture, one of the large men near the kitchen pulled a sleek, black pistol fitted with a suppressor from his jacket. He didn't aim it at anyone, but its sudden appearance sucked the remaining air out of the room. A woman at a nearby table let out a small, strangled gasp. "All phones on the table. Now!" the man at the bar commanded, his voice a flat, hard thing that allowed no argument. With trembling hands, patrons began to place their cell phones on the white linen tablecloths, like offerings to a dark god. Maya's mind was racing. Kitchen blocked. Entrance controlled. 2 heavy enforcers. 2 spotters. 1 leader. Target, Sterling. Objective, retrieval, not assassination. If they wanted him dead, he'd have been shot from the door. She saw the man by the kitchen glance in her direction, his eyes passing over her without a flicker of interest. She was furniture, a non-entity. It was the miscalculation she had built her life around. Silas leaned forward, placing his hands on Sterling's table. His voice dropped to a conspiratorial whisper. "We can do this quietly, Arthur, or we can do this loudly. The loud way involves me making a lasting impression on the decor and the clientele. I need the Keystone blueprint. You will give it to me and you will come with us for a debriefing." Sterling's composure, forged in decades of ruthless boardroom battles, finally cracked. A flicker of genuine shock, of raw fury, crossed his face at the mention of the Keystone blueprint. It was a minute reaction, a subtle twitch of a muscle beneath his eye. But Maya saw it, and Silas saw it. "Ah," Silas purred, his voice dripping with satisfaction. "So you do have it on you. Wonderful. That simplifies things immensely." He snapped his fingers. The 2 large men moved to grab Sterling. This was the moment. The flop had been dealt. The turn was coming. There was no more time for observation. Maya set the water pitcher she was holding down on her service station. The soft clink of glass on wood was barely audible, but in the crushing silence, it was a gunshot. The man at the bar, the closest threat, turned his head toward the sound, a flicker of annoyance on his face. In that half-second of distraction, Maya Jenkins ceased to be a waitress. The invisible girl vanished. In her place stood something else, something forged in nerve and observation, honed by a lifetime of reading intentions and calculating odds. Her entire posture changed. The slight, subservient slump of her shoulders straightened into a line of coiled tension. Her placid face became a mask of absolute focus. Her world contracted, reduced to threats, angles, weapons of opportunity, and percentages. The storm that had been brewing outside had just moved indoors, and she was its eye. Her first move was not an act of courage, but an act of pure, cold logic. The enforcer at the bar, the one who'd turned at the sound, was the closest, and he had the clearest line of sight to the most patrons. He was threat number one. He had to be taken off the board. Maya moved with a speed that was utterly incongruous with her quiet demeanor. One moment she was by the service station, the next she was a blur of black and white. In her hand, she now held a heavy silver tray, the kind used for tableside service. Her body had simply registered it as the best available weapon. Weight, balance, a hard edge. The enforcer, a man whose name was Gregor, had only a moment to register the impossible sight of the waitress closing the 10 feet between them with terrifying speed. His brain screamed threat, and his hands started moving for his weapon, but his reaction time was calibrated for civilians, not for this. Maya didn't swing the tray like a club. She held it vertically, like a shield, and drove forward. She didn't aim for his head, she aimed for his center of mass. The leading edge of the heavy silver tray slammed into Gregor's throat, right on his larynx. There was a sickening, wet crunch. His eyes bulged in shock and agony, his hands flying to his crushed windpipe as he made a horrifying gurgling sound. He couldn't breathe. He couldn't scream. He staggered backward, his weapon forgotten, and collapsed, his large body convulsing on the floor. A collective, horrified gasp swept through the restaurant. Silas, who was pulling a stunned Arthur Sterling from his booth, froze mid-motion, his face a mask of disbelief. His perfectly executed plan had just been shattered by a serving girl. "What the hell?" snarled the second heavy enforcer, a man named Ivan, who was stationed by the kitchen. He turned his attention and his gun toward Maya. This was the opening she had created. The odds had just improved. Maya didn't hesitate. She shoved a nearby serving cart laden with dirty dishes directly into Ivan's path. He instinctively sidestepped, his feet tangling for a split second in the long, white tablecloth that was draped over it. That microsecond of imbalance was all she needed. She lunged, staying low, moving toward the kitchen. She wasn't running to escape. She was running toward the next tactical advantage. She crashed through the swinging doors just as the first shot from Ivan's suppressed pistol erupted, a soft fatach, followed by the splintering of the doorframe where her head had been a heartbeat before. Inside the gleaming, stainless steel kitchen, the staff, 2 line cooks and a dishwasher, were huddled behind a prep table, their faces pale with terror. "Alley door, go now!" Maya's voice was no longer the soft whisper of a waitress. It was a sharp, hard command that cut through their fear. They scrambled to obey, fumbling with the deadbolt on the heavy steel door. Ivan kicked the swinging doors open, his pistol held ready. "You crazy bitch! You're dead!" Maya was already moving. On a steel counter next to her was a heavy meat tenderizer, a solid block of metal with a ridged face. She grabbed it. As Ivan entered, his eyes scanning for her, she hurled a stack of steel mixing bowls at his face. It was a child's move, a pure distraction, but it worked. He flinched, raising an arm to block the clattering metal. As he flinched, she exploded from behind the counter. She didn't go for his gun hand. Frank had taught her that was a fool's move. "You go for the man." She drove the heel of her left hand up under his chin, snapping his head back and rattling his teeth. As he staggered, disoriented, she brought the meat tenderizer down in a brutal, efficient arc onto the wrist of his gun hand. There was a loud, distinct snap of bone. Even screamed, a high-pitched sound of pure agony, and the pistol clattered to the tiled floor. She didn't stop. She drove a knee hard into his groin, and as he doubled over, she brought her hands together and slammed them down on the back of his exposed neck. He collapsed like a sack of cement. 2 down. Silence descended on the kitchen, broken only by the panicked rattling of the back door as the dishwasher finally got it open. The staff fled into the rain-slicked alley. Maya stood for a single, precious second, her chest heaving. Adrenaline was afire in her veins. The poker chip in her pocket felt white-hot against her leg. This was the part of her she had tried to bury for 5 years. The cold focus, the brutal calculus, the part that her grandfather had called playing the player, not the cards. It was the legacy of Frank, who had drilled one lesson into her until it was part of her soul. Hesitation is a grave. You act, you control, you finish. She scooped up Ivan's fallen pistol, a Sig Sauer P226. Her hands knew it instantly. She checked the magazine, full. Her movements were sure, practiced, a terrible muscle memory she hadn't used since she was 17. Back in the dining room, Silas's cold fury had reached a boiling point. He shoved Arthur Sterling back into the booth. "Don't move," he hissed. The 2 remaining men, the spotters, had their weapons drawn, but they were not enforcers. They were lookouts, observers. Their uncertainty was plain to see in their wide eyes and jerky movements. "What is she?" one of them whispered into his earpiece. "Doesn't matter what she is," Silas's voice crackled back. "Neutralize her. Now." Maya heard the scuff of their shoes on the carpet just outside the kitchen doors. They would be expecting her to come out shooting. So she did the opposite. On the stove, a large stock pot of soup was simmering. Using 2 thick dish towels, she lifted the heavy, scalding pot. She moved to the side of the doorframe and listened, slowing her breathing until she could hear her own heartbeat. She waited for the precise moment she heard a footstep directly in front of the door. Then, instead of pushing it open, she kicked the bottom of one of the doors with all her strength. It flew open, slamming into the man on the other side. Simultaneously, she swung the pot in a wide horizontal arc, sending a wave of boiling hot liquid flying through the doorway. A scream of pure, unadulterated agony ripped through the restaurant. The second spotter, caught full in the face and chest by the scalding soup, dropped his weapon and clawed at his blistering skin, his training and discipline instantly incinerated by primal pain. The first man, staggered by the door, was trying to recover his balance and bring his weapon to bear. Maya exploded out of the kitchen, ignoring the screaming man. She moved straight for the one who was still a threat. He fired a wild shot that went into the ceiling. Before he could fire again, she was on him. She didn't shoot him. She slammed the base of the heavy pistol into the side of his head, just above the ear. His eyes rolled back and he went down without a sound. 3 and 4 down. Now it was just Silas. Maya pivoted, the Sig held in a perfect 2-handed grip, her stance balanced, her hands rock steady. She and Silas stood 40 feet apart, separated by a landscape of overturned tables and terrified diners lying flat on the floor. In his booth, Arthur Sterling was watching, his face a canvas of utter, dumbfounded astonishment. Silas had his own weapon out now, aimed not at her, but squarely at Sterling's head. A standoff. "Drop it," Silas said, his voice a low, dangerous hiss. The arrogant smirk was gone, replaced by a look of cold, murderous appraisal. "Drop it, or the old man's legacy ends with a hole in his head." Maya's gaze was like ice. Her finger rested lightly on the trigger. "You walk out that door," she said, her voice steady, betraying none of the adrenaline thundering through her. "You leave alone, and you get to live." Silas let out a harsh, incredulous laugh. "You have no idea who you're dealing with, little girl. You think you're some kind of action hero? You're a waitress with a lucky streak. I have dismantled corporations for Marcus Thorne. I have ruined men 100 times more powerful than you." "I don't care if your boss is the King of England," Maya replied, her voice dropping to a near whisper. "You brought a war to my table. You threatened my customers. And I am asking you, one last time, to cash out and leave." For the first time, Silas truly saw her. Not the uniform, not the job. He saw the set of her shoulders, the unwavering focus in her eyes, the professional way she held the weapon. He was an expert at reading people, at spotting weakness, but looking at her, he saw none. He saw a player with a stone-cold bluff, or worse, a player holding a royal flush. And for the first time in a very long time, a sliver of uncertainty, a feeling he despised, found its way into his heart. Who the hell was she? The tension in the founder's table stretched thin, as taut as a piano wire. The air, once thick with the scent of fine food, now smelled of fear and cordite. Marco Bellini held his gun steady on Julian Croft, but his eyes were locked on Alara. His mind, trained in threat assessment, was struggling to categorize her. She wasn't law enforcement. Her movements were too raw, too efficient, lacking the procedural stiffness. She wasn't military. Her focus was on disabling, not killing. She was something else, something he hadn't encountered. "You've made a serious miscalculation, Waitress," Silas said, his voice a low sneer. He was trying to regain control, to reassert his dominance in a situation that had spun wildly out of his grasp. "Mr. Thorne pays very well for success. My men's families will be well compensated for their retirement." He was raising the stakes, showing her he had nothing to lose. Maya didn't flinch. Her gaze flickered for a fraction of a second, not away from him, but past him, to the massive, polished wood bar back. The mirror behind the liquor bottles gave her a clear, if distorted, view of the front of the restaurant. No sirens yet, no flashing lights. In the insulated, soundproofed opulence of the restaurant, it was possible no one on the outside had any idea what was happening. Response time was a variable she couldn't count on. It was still just them. The table was closed. "This doesn't have to end with anyone else getting hurt," she said, her tone level. It wasn't a plea. It was an offer of a final bet, a chance for him to fold his hand before the last card was turned. Arthur Sterling, who had been watching this incredible exchange with a mixture of terror and utter awe, slowly began to push himself up from his seat. He was a man accustomed to being the master of his own destiny, and his instincts were screaming at him to do something. "Stay down!" Maya and Silas snapped in perfect lethal unison. Their heads whipped towards Sterling, and in that shared moment of furious distraction, the game changed. It was the opening Silas had been waiting for. He wasn't a fool. His mission was to extract Sterling and the blueprint. Killing him was a failure. So instead of pulling the trigger on the billionaire, he fired a shot at the massive crystal chandelier hanging in the center of the room. The suppressed foot was followed by a loud crack as the bullet struck the chandelier's central support. The magnificent crystal structure, weighing hundreds of pounds, didn't fall, but it shuddered violently, raining down a shower of crystal shards and dust. The sudden noise and motion were a sensory grenade. It was a diversion, designed to overload and disorient. As Maya's eyes instinctively flickered upward, Silas moved. He didn't charge her. He dove sideways, sliding behind the thick, overturned mahogany table of a prominent judge, using it for cover. He was a professional. He knew the value of solid protection. "You're good," he called out, his voice slightly muffled by the wood. "I'll give you that, but you're one person. I have all the time in the world. Sooner or later, you'll make a mistake." Maya's mind was working, calculating the new odds. He was right. In a prolonged firefight, she was at a disadvantage. She had to end this now. She had to force his hand. She began to move not toward him, but away, using the line of high-backed leather booths for cover, circling toward the service hallway. It became a deadly game of hide-and-seek among the ruins of fine dining. "Who trained you?" Silas called out, his voice a probe, trying to get a read on her, to build a profile. "You move like someone I knew in Chechnya. You're no amateur." Maya remained silent. She didn't want him to pinpoint her location from her voice. She moved like a phantom, her soft-soled work shoes making no sound on the plush carpet. She passed a table where a terrified young couple was huddled, the man shielding the woman with his body. Maya met his eyes for a split second, and in her gaze was a silent, steely promise. "Stay down. It's almost over." She reached the maitre d's station near the front entrance. On it was a heavy bronze bust of the restaurant's founder, a solid piece of metal that weighed at least 30 pounds. An idea, desperate and dangerous, a pure bluff began to form in her mind. Silas, meanwhile, was growing impatient. This silence, this invisibility, unnerved him. He risked a quick glance over the top of his table. Nothing. He dropped back down. He was preparing to move to a new position when a flicker of movement caught his eye. Not in the dining room, but in the reflection of the large Rain Street window facing the street. For a split second, he saw Maya's form reflected in the glass, standing near the front of the restaurant. He reacted on pure instinct, rising and firing 2 quick shots in that direction. Phut! Phut! The window didn't just shatter. It exploded inwards in a cascade of glass and cold, wet air. The sounds of the city, traffic, a distant siren, flooded the restaurant, breaking the spell of isolation. But Maya wasn't there. What he had seen was the reflection of her black waitress vest, which she had draped over the bronze bust and held up for a single calculated second. It was a classic poker move her grandfather had taught her. If you want to know what your opponent is holding, make a small bet you can afford to lose. While Silas was firing at a ghost, Maya was sprinting, low and fast from the side, closing the distance to his position. Silas realized his mistake the instant he pulled the trigger. The reflection was wrong. The angle was off. He spun, trying to acquire his new target, but it was too late. She was already on him. She crashed into him not with her body, but with the heavy bronze bust, which she swung with all her momentum. The solid metal connected with his shoulder with a sickening thud, spinning him around and knocking his pistol from his grasp. It went skittering away under a nearby table. Now it was close. No guns, just skill, will, and pain. Silas was strong, his body a weapon honed by years of brutal training. He roared in fury and lunged for her. But Maya wasn't there to trade blows. She was there to dismantle a machine. As he reached for her, she sidestepped and drove the sharp, pointed corner of the bust's base directly into his knee. He screamed as his leg buckled, a raw, animal sound of agony that was a world away from his earlier, cool composure. He swung a wild, powerful fist. She ducked under it, and as his arm passed over her, she dropped the bust and locked his arm in a vicious joint lock, applying pressure to his elbow in a way it was never meant to bend. The blueprint, he gurgled through the pain, blood from a split lip filling his mouth. Even in agony, his focus was on the mission. Thorne will find it. He'll burn everything Sterling has. Maya ignored him. She increased the pressure on his arm, her face a mask of cold fury. This was for the terrified couple. This was for George, the maitre d' who always saved her a piece of the staff's apple pie. This was for the promise she'd made to never let a bully win the pot. With a final, sickening pop, she dislocated his elbow. Silas's roar died in his throat, replaced by a choked, ragged sob. The fight was gone, extinguished by a pain so total it left no room for anything else. He collapsed, his body trembling, his one good arm cradling his ruined one. He was broken. Maya stood up, her breath coming in ragged gasps. She looked down at the man who had brought chaos into her sanctuary. His face was a mess, his expensive suit torn and dirty. She felt no triumph, only a grim, hollow exhaustion. She scanned the room. The other 4 men were down, incapacitated. The patrons were slowly, tentatively, beginning to stir, watching her with a mixture of terror and utter awe. And in his booth, Arthur Sterling was slowly getting to his feet, his face pale, his gray eyes fixed on her with an expression she couldn't begin to read. The fight was over. The violence had ended. But for Maya Jenkins, the true battle was just beginning. Because as she looked from the defeated Silas to the bewildered billionaire, a name Silas had spoken echoed in her memory, a name from one of her grandfather's old stories. Marcus Thorne. Her blood ran colder than it had at any point during the fight. Marcus Thorne. The magician, they used to call him in the underground Vegas games. A prodigy who had shown up out of nowhere. A player who never seemed to lose. Her grandfather had always been suspicious of him. A man who never shows his tells, kid, he'd said once, swirling whiskey in a glass, isn't a good player. He's a cheat. Thorne had vanished from the poker scene years ago, only to resurface as a phantom in the world of tech and finance, a man known for hostile takeovers that left his rivals as gutted and empty as a busted flush. And Arthur Sterling, it seemed, was his latest mark. The immediate aftermath was a strange, suspended moment between violence and consequence. The newly arrived sounds of the city, the wail of distant sirens finally growing closer, poured in through the shattered window, mixing with the soft, terrified whimpers of a few patrons and the ragged, pain-filled breathing of Silas. Maya stood in the center of the wreckage, the Sig Sauer still held loosely at her side. The tidal wave of adrenaline was beginning to recede, leaving behind a deep, bone-weary ache and the phantom smell of stale cigar smoke and fear in her nostrils. Her knuckles were scraped raw from the kitchen fight, and a deep bruise was already purpling on her forearm where she'd blocked a wild swing, but she felt none of it. All she could feel was the seismic shock of that name, Marcus Thorne. Her mind, which had been a marvel of tactical clarity just moments before, was now a maelstrom. She saw her grandfather, a mountain of a man with gentle eyes and hands that could shuffle a deck of cards into a work of art. He had built a small but comfortable life for them from his winnings, a life based on a strict code of honor among the lawless. You don't cheat. You don't steal. You play the hand you're dealt with skill and nerve. And you never, ever let a man like Marcus Thorne sit at your table. Thorne had broken that world. He had used technology, tiny earpieces, signalers, to fleece players, including some of her grandfather's oldest friends, driving them to ruin. Her grandfather had been the one to expose him, at great personal risk. The fallout had been ugly, forcing her grandfather out of the life he knew and into a quiet, resentful retirement. Thorne had shattered their world not with fists, but with a betrayal of the code. And now, years later, she had just saved the man Thorne was trying to destroy. The irony was a physical blow, knocking the wind from her lungs more effectively than any punch. She had just protected Arthur Sterling, a man whose name represented the old guard, the very type of established power her grandfather had always respected, from the modern, venomous incarnation of the man who had ruined him. "Miss Jenkins," Arthur Sterling's voice cut through her reverie. He had moved from his booth and was standing a few feet away, his suit surprisingly immaculate save for a dusting of plaster. His face was a complex mask of shock, gratitude, and an intense burning curiosity. He was looking at her not as a waitress, but as an impossible equation he desperately needed to solve. "Are you all right?" he asked, his voice rough. Maya could only nod, her throat too tight to speak. She looked at the groaning man on the floor, Silas, Thorne's auditor. He worked for the cheat, the man who had broken her grandfather's spirit, and she had just crippled him to protect. What exactly? A rival captain of industry? "He said they wanted the Keystone Blueprint," Sterling stated, his voice low and urgent, his eyes scanning the room to ensure no one was close enough to overhear. "How could he possibly know I had it with me?" Maya finally found her voice, though it came out as a strained whisper. "What is it?" "It's—" Sterling hesitated, his gaze sweeping over her, assessing her. He was a man who never showed his cards, but his entire game had just been blown apart. "It's not just a design. It's the original, hand-drawn schematics for a hydrostatic engine I designed 40 years ago. An engine that runs on a closed loop, almost no fuel. I was young. I thought it was too dangerous, too destabilizing. I buried it." Silas, lying on the floor cradling his ruined arm, let out a pained, wheezing laugh. "Buried it," he spat, blood flecking his lips. "He calls it burying it. Thorne calls it hoarding. That blueprint could have powered the world, made energy free for everyone. But this man," he glared at Sterling, "he couldn't control it, couldn't monetize it to his satisfaction, so he locked it away to protect his fossil fuel investments. Thorne doesn't want to steal it. He wants to liberate it." Maya's eyes snapped back to Sterling, a silent question burning in them. Sterling's jaw tightened, the muscles flexing in his cheek. Thorne's vision is a child's fantasy. Releasing that technology without control would collapse the global economy overnight. It would cause wars. He's not a liberator. He's an anarchist in $1,000 suit. I did what was necessary to maintain stability. You did what was necessary to maintain your throne, Silas snarled. You're a dinosaur, Sterling, and Thorne is the asteroid. Every word was a hammer blow to the foundations of Maya's world. Her grandfather's enemy, Marcus Thorne, was being painted as a revolutionary. The man she had just saved, Arthur Sterling, was being cast as a gatekeeper, a tyrant hoarding progress for his own gain. She was protecting the villain of her own family story. The worn poker chip in her pocket suddenly felt impossibly heavy, a weight pulling her down. It represented her grandfather's code, a code of honor and fair play. And what had she just done? She had become an enforcer for a king who kept the best cards locked away from the rest of the world. Her grip on the Sig Sauer loosened. The weight of it was suddenly unbearable. What was she defending? The stability of a rigged game? Sterling saw the shift in her eyes. He was a master at reading people in a boardroom, and he saw her allegiance wavering like a stock price in a panic. He knew he was losing her. "Miss Jenkins," he said, his voice dropping, becoming more personal, more urgent. "I don't know what you know of Marcus Thorne, but I can tell you this. The world is not a simple game of good hands and bad hands. It is a complex machine with 1 billion moving parts. Thorne wants to throw a wrench in it and call it progress. I am trying to keep it running for the people who depend on it." The approaching sirens were louder now, a wailing crescendo just a block or two away. The window of opportunity for choices, for actions, was closing. Silas, seeing the same conflict in Maya's face, tried to press his advantage. "He's lying," he coughed, a pained rattle in his chest. "Thorne, he wants to give everyone a seat at the table. Sterling wants to own the table. Who do you think someone like you should be fighting for?" Maya looked from the bleeding messenger to the powerful tycoon. Both men were dealing from the bottom of the deck, framing their greed and ambition as a moral crusade. She was caught in the middle, a wild card in their high-stakes war. Her past and her present had just collided with the force of a train wreck, and she was standing in the wreckage holding a gun, with no idea which way to turn. The police would be here any second. They would see a waitress with a gun in a room full of bodies. They would see a billionaire witness. The story would be written for her, the official narrative set in stone. But in this single fleeting moment, before the flashing lights painted the walls red and blue, the choice was still hers. Who was she? The inheritor of her grandfather's grudge against Thorne, or the protector of the man Thorne was trying to destroy? Her hidden skill had changed everything, but now a hidden truth threatened to undo it all. The wail of the sirens was nearly on top of them, the rhythmic pulse of blue and red lights flashing across the shattered front window, painting the chaotic dining room in strobes of official consequence. In seconds, the room would be flooded with uniforms, questions, and a version of the truth that would be scrubbed clean of all its messy complexities. This fleeting moment was the last bet Maya could make before the house intervened. Arthur Sterling saw the storm of indecision in her eyes and made a final, desperate play. It wasn't a threat, or an order, or a plea for loyalty. It was a calculated appeal to the woman he had just seen in action. "Miss Jenkins." "Maya," he said, the use of her first name a deliberate intimacy, a bridge across the chasm between them. "Forget me. Forget Thorne. Forget the blueprint. Look around this room." He gestured with his head to the terrified patrons, who were slowly pushing themselves up, eyes wide with fear and awe. They don't care about hydrostatic engines or corporate warfare. They were just people having dinner. "You didn't just save my life. You saved theirs. Whatever my sins, whatever Thorne's virtues, you protected the innocent. That's the only truth that matters right now." His words struck a chord, cutting through the noise of her personal history. Her gaze drifted from his face to the young couple, who were now helping an elderly man to his feet. She saw George, the maitre d', quietly reassuring his terrified staff. Sterling was right. Her actions, born from a lifetime of training to survive a different kind of war, had created a shield for everyone in this room. Her loyalty, in that moment, wasn't to Sterling's empire or her grandfather's memory. It was to them. It was to the promise she had made to herself that no one, in her presence, would ever be the helpless victim at a predator's table again. The conflict in her eyes didn't vanish, but it sharpened into a new kind of resolve. It was no longer about choosing Sterling or Thorne. It was about taking control of the game itself. She took 3 purposeful steps and stood over the defeated Silas. He flinched as her shadow fell over him. She crouched down, her movements calm and deliberate. "Your boss still wants his property," she said, her voice a low command. "You're going to give him a message for me." Silas stared at her, his face a mask of confusion and pain. Sterling watched, his expression a mixture of apprehension and fascination. What was she doing? "What message?" Silas rasped. "You tell Marcus Thorne that the Keystone Blueprint is now held by a neutral third party," Maya said, her voice as cold and clear as ice water. "It is secure. It is off the table. If he or anyone associated with him ever makes another move against Mr. Sterling or any of the people in this room tonight, the full contents of that blueprint will be released publicly. Not to a competitor, but to the world. For free." Sterling's eyes widened. She was bluffing. She didn't have the blueprint. It was an audacious, impossible bluff. Silas, however, didn't know that. He saw the unwavering conviction in her eyes, the cold certainty of a player holding an unbeatable hand. You don't have it," he challenged weakly. Maya leaned in closer, her voice dropping to a whisper meant only for him. "Your men are alive, battered, but alive. I could have killed every single one of you. I chose not to. Do I seem like the kind of person who bluffs on a weak hand?" She paused, letting the words sink in. "You tell him the old poker player's granddaughter has it. He'll know exactly what that means." The mention of her grandfather was the final card. It recontextualized everything for Silas. This wasn't a random waitress. This was personal. This was a ghost from Thorne's past rising up to become his greatest liability. He simply nodded, the last of the fight draining out of him, replaced by a chilling understanding. Maya stood and turned to face Sterling. She held out the Sig Sauer, grip first. "I believe this is she said, her tone suddenly, shockingly professional, as if she were returning a dropped wallet. Sterling stared at the gun, then back at her face. He understood instantly what she had done. She hadn't chosen his side. She had created her own. She had engineered a stalemate, a form of mutually assured destruction that protected him far more effectively than any army of bodyguards. And in doing so, she had seized all the leverage. She now held the power over both him and Thorne. He didn't take the gun. The sounds of heavy boots were on the pavement just outside. "The police will need that," he said quietly. "They'll have questions. A lot of them. My lawyers will be here in 20 minutes. Don't say a word until they arrive." "I can handle my own questions," she replied, a hint of steel in her voice. He managed a small wry smile. "Of course you can." He reached into his jacket pocket, and for a heart-stopping moment, Maya tensed. But he wasn't reaching for a weapon. From a hidden pocket sewn into the lining of his suit, he withdrew a thin, carbon fiber cylinder, no bigger than a lipstick tube, the Keystone Blueprint. Without a word, he pressed it into her hand. Maya's fingers closed around it, the warmth from his hand, the cool, hard reality of the object. It was an act of either absolute insanity or the most brilliant strategic move of his life. He was placing his entire legacy, his greatest vulnerability, into the hands of the only person who had proven she could defend it. He was moving his queen to the most powerful and unpredictable square on the board. "You said it was held by a third party," he said, his voice barely a whisper as the first 2 police officers burst through the doorway, weapons drawn. "Now it is. NYPD, drop the weapon, hands in the air." Slowly, deliberately, Maya placed the Sig Sauer on a nearby table and raised her empty hands, her right fist tightly clenched around the small cylinder that had caused so much chaos. Her face was calm, her expression unreadable. She was no longer just Maya Jenkins, the waitress. She was no longer just the ghost of her grandfather's legacy. She was something new, forged in the crucible of that night. As the police swarmed the scene, Securing the groaning henchman and calling for paramedics, a lead detective approached her and Sterling. Sterling immediately took charge, his voice regaining its familiar tone of command, weaving a narrative of a targeted kidnapping gone wrong, of a brave young woman who had defended herself and others. He was protecting her, spinning a story that would keep her out of a prison cell. But Maya knew the truth. This wasn't the end. It was the opening play in a brand new game. She had stepped out of the shadows and in doing so, had placed herself at the center of a war between two ruthless men. One whose family her grandfather had exposed, the other whose life she had just saved. And in her hand, she held the ultimate wild card, the blueprint that could build a new future or burn their empires to the ground. The choice was no longer about whose side to be on, but about what the new rules of the game were going to be. The days that followed were a blur of legal maneuvering and calculated silence. Arthur Sterling's formidable legal team descended upon the situation like a quiet, efficient army, shaping the narrative for the authorities. The official story became a foiled corporate kidnapping, with Maya Jenkins cast as the civilian who acted with unexpected and heroic resourcefulness. The truth, in all its thorny complexity, was buried beneath a mountain of sealed documents and non-disclosure agreements signed by every patron and staff member of the founders' table, each compensated handsomely for their silence. A week later, Maya was not in a police interrogation room, but in Arthur Sterling's office. It was a vast, minimalist space at the top of a skyscraper, with floor-to-ceiling windows that offered a godlike view of the Chicago skyline. Sterling stood by the window, a silhouette against the city he had helped build. "I owe you a debt," he began, turning to face her. His usual granite-like expression was softened by a look of genuine respect. "A debt that money cannot repay. However," he gestured to a leather portfolio on his desk, "that contains the deed to a property and the details of a trust fund that will ensure you never have to serve another plate of prime rib in your life unless you choose to." He paused, his gray eyes intense. "But that is not why I asked you here. I am not offering you a job as my head of security. A security chief reacts to threats. You anticipate the entire game. You see the board in ways I am only beginning to understand." He walked to the window and gestured to the sprawling city below. "My world is no longer just fought in boardrooms. It's fought in the shadows by men like Silas, for men like Thorne. The rules have changed. I need to change with them." He turned back to her. "I am creating a new independent department, one that doesn't officially exist. It will not answer to my board or my executives. It will answer only to me. Its mandate will be to identify and neutralize threats to this company and its stability before they even have a name. Your department." It was an offer of immense power, a kingdom of shadows. Maya had spent 5 years trying to escape the skills Frank and her grandfather had taught her, and now she was being asked to build an empire upon them. She met his gaze, her expression unreadable. "I accept," she said, her voice clear and steady, "on 3 conditions." Sterling's eyebrow arched in surprise. He was not a man accustomed to being given conditions. "First," Maya stated, her tone firm, "Marcus Thorne is to be left alone. No retaliation, no corporate attacks, nothing. The stalemate I created holds. He stays down, and you let him stay there. My fight was never with him personally, it was with his methods." It was a staggering demand, to offer his greatest enemy a truce. Sterling studied her for a long moment, then gave a single sharp nod. "Done." "Second," she continued, "the department you're creating won't be yours. It will be ours. It will be an independent entity, funded by you, but its decisions will be made by a 2-person board. You and me. You represent the interests of stability. I will represent the interests of the code my grandfather lived by. Fair play. We will only act when a line has been crossed." This was not a job. It was a partnership, a check and balance on his immense power. A slow, genuine smile spread across Sterling's face. He had expected to hire a weapon. Instead, he had found a conscience. "Agreed." "And third," Maya said, her voice softening slightly as she opened her hand. In her palm lay the carbon fiber cylinder. "The Keystone Blueprint. It stays with me. It doesn't belong to you or to Thorne. It's the leverage that ensures our partnership remains balanced. It's the collateral that guarantees that the man trying to keep the machine running doesn't become the machine itself. For a long moment, the billionaire was silent, studying the young woman before him. The waitress who had dismantled a team of professional killers, bluffed a master manipulator into a stalemate, and was now negotiating with him for the soul of his company. "Welcome to the board, Ms. Jenkins," he said, extending his hand. Maya took it. As their hands clasped, a new contract was sealed, high above the city. The waitress was gone, a ghost left behind in a closed-for-renovations restaurant. In her place stood a new kind of power, a queen on a board of her own design, forever guarding the thin, precarious line between order and justice. And so the story of that autumn night at the founder's table comes to a close. But the story of Maya Jenkins has just begun. It's a powerful reminder that the quietest people in the room are often the most observant, and that the lessons learned from our past can become the weapons that define our future. In a world of kings and titans, it took a girl with a poker chip in her pocket to remind them all that the most powerful hand isn't always the one with the most cards, but the one played with the most skill, the most courage, and an unbreakable code of honor.